Good. The music you were hearing was from A Colonial Christmas. It included a whole series of songs from Washington's March, Soldier's Joy, and a particular favorite that will be appropriate to today's lecture, Yankee Doodle. I'll explain that later. My attire is not quite appropriate to this lecture because we'll be covering the period from 1740 through the 1760s and 70s. This is actually from 1735. So we're a little out of time. This is fragment 6, the end of the game. I put them all up online last Wednesday, I think. And that's my little clue for you. You have to know your movie history to help find it. They're all up online. Again, to review the other fragments, you remember fragment 1, 2, fragment 3, 4, 5. I think that's it. Yep. And hand in all your estimates on Wednesday. There will be no class next Monday, I remind you, because it's President's Day. So we will be resuming on the Wednesday. Now, there are some papers that are due on Monday, I believe next week. There will be no sections on Monday. So those papers will be collected, I believe, in class on Wednesday. In class on Wednesday. Okay. You want to add anything?
I want to add.
Yes.
And that means in class on Wednesday, not emailed on Wednesday. Email doesn't count as turning it in. In person, a hard copy counts as turning it in. So I just want to remind you to avoid the temptation to just email it. Okay.
That's same for my sections.
Okay. We will be periodically doing, taking attendance during lectures. Of course, we take them all the time during discussion sections, so I just will remind you about that as well. Okay. Any questions before we proceed? Okay. This week, we will be covering the last half of the 18th century as we continue rapidly to get into the 19th and 20th centuries, where we will dawdle a little more slowly. This period, this era will culminate in New York City becoming the capital, of course, of a whole new nation, which it will be for a very short period of time, from March 4th, 1789, only to August 12th of 1790. And that's the period which Federal Hall, downtown, is the capital of the United States. That whole era, of course, is punctuated by what we call the War for Independence, or the American Revolution. And like my discussion or intimation last time when we talked about what is called the Negro Riot, naming is always rather important, whether it's thought of as a revolution or a war for independence, whether something gets called a Negro Riot rather than the riot of white men, all has to do with how people understood the event at the time and afterwards, and how they assess agency or responsibility for the events. How is the city changed for the inhabitants? How is daily life made different? What is daily life like? Is there a revolution? Is it revolutionarily different in some way than it had been? This is a question, an age-old question that had been asked by one of America's earliest professional historians, a man by the name of Carl Becker, who simply asked, is the American Revolution a social movement? Or is it primarily a political movement? And how do we understand the character of the social change that takes place? We know that economic and political transformations in England, as we've traced, shape colonial social conditions. In the 1740s and 50s, the period that really opens this era, there are constant continental wars, but they embroil the colonies and affect everyday life. So soldiers are quartered here, you got to pay them. Okay? Taxes have to be raised for them. They walk the streets. They assert authority. They shop in our stores. So they affect everyday life. And of course, the colonies were concerned in part just because our own security was at stake. While these wars often were between colonial empires in Europe, they did involve the French and the Indians in particular, or the French and Indian Wars, as we know them, back here in the American colonies. Montreal, in fact, as many of you I hope know, is only 300 miles away. So security from foreign threats always at least remained in the back of people's minds as a real possibility. The city, as a consequence, from the 40s going forward, was on a constant state of alert. They didn't have colors to describe them. They weren't orange alert, green alert, but constant state of alerts indicated by flags being positioned, soldiers marching, regular calls for militia, etc. The militia, for instance, had fairly daily drills on the commons down around the Battery. So there were constant reminders to people that one had to stay alert and be ready. During this period, New York City merchants, as we've described, were increasingly prospering or struggling to prosper, and war could be an advantage or a disadvantage. It could liberate them from the competition of foreigners, or it could endanger their ships on the high seas to foreign powers that were at war with us. So war was often a mixed blessing, and it really depended often on what kind of merchant you were, whether you supported it at one moment in time or another. And so we'll see that the role of the merchants vacillates over this period and shapes a good deal of the political history. On the seas, one worried about privateering from French ships. 70 ships operated out of New York City as privateers, just out of our own harbor. So there were all kinds of ships from both sides, from our own side and those with whom we were at war, who were often basically pirates. Okay? And the soldiers had to be provisioned, as I mentioned before. That meant taxes, it meant foodstuffs, and at a cost to someone. Remember again, this is a period that is British history. We are concerned, some people, with being loyal subjects of the crown. And to be loyal is to pay taxes and is to support our brethren who are fighting for us, i.e. soldiers. But not all understood it quite in those terms, because the distance of 3,000 miles could at times make these people seem to be not quite us. So they are us and they're not quite us. And it's in that kind of liminal ground that New Yorkers often existed, as did the other colonists. New Yorkers, more than any other colony, ended up siding with the crown, as we'll see in this story. But that didn't mean that there weren't many who felt disquiet with that position. Complicating this political turmoil with all of its economic ramifications is something called the Industrial Revolution. That's to say, the character of work, the development of goods, is being transformed in dramatic ways. And while the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about, really begins in England in mid-century, it will affect the United States. It will affect the American colonies in particular during this period. New technologies were going to increase production, and the increase in production, or the new technologies, was in turn going to create the need for new skills, threaten people who maybe had old skills, and help to produce a lot of stuff. That's to say, the need for markets. Okay? Somebody's making a lot of cloth, they want you to buy it. So the origins of the whole notion that one had to have fine things or more things is encouraged, what we would call conspicuous consumption, if you'd like, or just consumption, by the increased production of goods. The Industrial Revolution sets that in motion. It makes it increasingly possible. It accelerates it. There was production well before that, but this accelerates the process. The heart of the early Industrial Revolution was textiles. And indeed, New York was cold. Almost everybody needed clothing. And sometimes more clothing and sometimes less, but you needed clothing. And even if it was warm, we had sufficient notions of propriety that we expected people to at least cover themselves. This was, after all, not the South Sea Islands. Those of you who know Melville's early novels, Omu and Taipei, where the American can go wandering in the South Sea Islands and suddenly feel shame because he's not wearing clothes. Well, here we were taught, we were, after all, good Puritan stock in our own ways, that kind of Protestant stock. We believed in covering oneself. So you needed clothing for all seasons, and that meant even different kinds of clothing. So textiles was kind of fundamental to just daily life. It didn't require dramatic changes. We all wore clothing already. The first machine that was developed, all these early machines are developed in England, not in the Americas. They are brought over to the Americas only at the end of the century. They're under copyright. They're brought over in people's heads. So the only way they could be brought here is basically by stealing them. And they're stolen by people seeing the technology, bringing it in their heads, coming here, and then rebuilding the machine. It's not unlike the ways in which people move between corporations with ideas today. So it's not totally foreign to you. But in the middle of the 18th century that we're beginning with this story, this is all in England taking place. But it'll affect us. What's the first machine? It's the spinning jenny. A spinning jenny. Anybody know how you make cloth? How you make clothes? Anybody here make clothes? Where would you start? If you need it, where do you start the process?
Do I start the process?
Yeah.
I get the fabric.
You already get the fabric. Okay, but the question, of course, is where does the fabric come from? It comes from a loom. How does the loom get its material? Where does it begin?
The yarn, or like the thread, the yarn.
The thread, the yarn. Okay, what is that material called?
Cotton.
Cotton and later wool. Yarn is wool, right? But cotton in particular is what we're talking about in this early period. And does cotton look like a shirt?
No.
No. How do you get from a cotton ball to a shirt? How do you get it to the loom? It comes in balls, right? You've got to make it into strings. You've got to make it into something called thread, right? Anybody ever actually pick cotton here? You lead dissolute lives, right? In truth, it would be helpful if you had, only because it would help you appreciate the amazing early technologies. Much harder to understand how a computer is made or how it actually works. But this would be something with your hands you could actually imagine. You pick a ball of cotton, okay? And how many of you have seen, you've bought cotton, right? People have bought cotton. Does it look like thread? Well, how are you going to make it into thread? How would you imagine making it into thread? Anybody have any idea how you might do that? Well, you have to comb it. You stick a comb through it. There are fibers in the cotton. And that combing the cotton is called carding. And you card it and you begin to get some little fibers. But that doesn't have much strength. It would break very easily. When you want to make thread, one of the concerns you have when you have thread is that it not break all the time on you, right? So how do you make thread strong? Anybody have any idea how you might do it? You twist it. Okay? You twist it. Okay? And then you hold it all together so the twist goes. And that's what's done effectively on a jenny. It is spinning the thread. Okay? Spinning the thread. Richard Arkwright improves this with a spinning frame and ends up with 3 sets of rollers that turn at different speeds. So these rollers produce yarns of different thicknesses that begin to develop that can hold them firmly together. The machine produces a stronger thread. Each machine, however, is also faster, more dangerous, and more complex to operate. So it begins to require somebody who knows how to work on it. It requires somebody who knows how to fix it. And it often injures your fingers in ways in which it hadn't before. So all of that's being transformed. And you want to find somebody who can do it. It costs money. You've got to pay somebody to do that. So it gets built into a new process of production involving costs that are going to be passed on to consumers. So all of these things are beginning to be transformed. And when you're producing the thread, that doesn't make the shirt. You then need to take it to the loom. Okay? What is that process like? That's called weaving, some of you know. Okay? And that's yet another skilled person. And that's where the threads often are connected from end to end, vertical, and then a shuttle flies through it up and down. Okay? Have any idea, have anybody seen a loom or know how a loom works? So you'll know that the threads are connected at one end at the other end, and every other thread goes up and down so that a shuttlecock can go through it, take the thread through it. It will therefore be on every other level. It'll be pushed down so that you're beginning to get fabric, and then it'll fly back the other way. That's a flying shuttle. You don't hope that the string doesn't break, because then where does the flying shuttle go? It hits Janie, who's working on the next loom, hopefully not in the eye. Okay? So this is all very delicate technology beginning to emerge, but it's creating something called fabric. So you can start to do something with it. We haven't talked about that process yet. Okay? So one of the things that happens, if you can produce more and more thread, what do you need for the loom? You need a faster loom that can use the thread more. So there's reciprocal technologies that are created in England to make all this go faster and faster and faster, and be more complex, more sophisticated, if you'd like. And it requires new people who have these skills, and they become quite valuable. Spinners, weavers, okay, carders, all the skilled new craftsmen of the Industrial Revolution, who will be put together into one place where the person making the thread is located next to the person doing the weaving. And that becomes something that's called a factory. Not just a workshop, but a building that can assemble all those people together and then presume that they're going to be supervised or operated upon. And once they're supervised and operated upon, one of the things that happens is they all have to show up for work at the same time. It doesn't do us any good if you're an owner or a manufacturer to have the workforce decide some will come in one day, some will come in another day, some will make a lot of thread, but nobody will be doing the weaving. So what do you begin to presume when you're an employer? Regularity, that people show up for work in a regular way. You have to create a whole new type of person, which we will, excuse the gender bias here, called industrial man. The irony is that industrial man was a woman. And more often, she was a child. Okay? So it's worth knowing that all the literature about industrial men is really about Earth and the Industrial Revolution. It's actually worked on by women, bossed by men, women and children. And you'll see that later when you read Stanzel's essay on cloth making in New York City in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, how that process continues without work. The invention of the spinning frame, the jenny, the frame, weaving, carding, created a new demand for raw materials and for markets, both of which implicated the colonies. Okay? For raw materials, they need cotton. Does that affect New York? Does that affect New York? How much is a lot of cotton being grown in New York? Or is that the wrong question? How might it affect New York, do you think? The slave trade, that's one way, right? The slave trade is making, slaves are growing the cotton in the South, and New Yorkers are bringing the slaves there. Anything else? Yeah, transporting it. You can say the same thing? Yeah, okay. We're providing the ships to transport all this stuff. Okay. Where is it being brought back to? To Manchester. Okay. Later, first to Liverpool, the market, and then Manchester, the new industrial heartland of England, okay, where the work was going to be. That's where it's going to be made into the cloth. Okay. So already New Yorkers are involved in the Industrial Revolution in terms of increased scale of shipbuilders, of ship makers, of the shipping trade, increased consumption and production of human labor called slaves. And the capital to make all that work is from London and from New York. Okay? So we're paying for it. We're greasing the wheel. We're not the only ones, but we're the major ones on this side of the Atlantic doing that. So that's one way in which the Industrial Revolution we think of as happening just on that side is already transforming life on this side, and in New York City in particular. The other side, of course, is consumption. One of the things about making all that cloth is that you take the cloth and then what do you transform the cloth into? Clothing. And who wears the clothing? Why, we do. Mind you, the English do as well, though rather badly, if I may say, except when they're dressed to their fine. But they do want to find additional markets, and New York is a market. And increasingly, New Yorkers will be encouraged to be a market. It will not surprise you later that one act of revolutionary independence will be to insist to end dependence on London markets. So during the Revolutionary War, or War for Independence, which is what I think is more appropriate, during the War for Independence, one of the claims that the revolutionaries or the independence fighters will make of farmers and others is to make homespun. Buy American. Don't become dependent on foreign markets. Okay? And that will begin to encourage the development of American production, you see, later on. But this early period, we already understand by the 1750s and 60s, the Industrial Revolution is transforming daily life here in terms of raw materials. The key is that New York is a valuable market for the consumption of British cloth. And the rise of this consumer market in New York City is seen most vividly in the rise of what was described in the media as that of the silk stockings. Of what were described as the bigwigs walking the streets. These were the people of means. These were the people who wished to dress properly and had the money to dress properly, and did so. New York City, that's to say, becomes the center of a new kind of global market. But I want to say something, if I may, as by way of detour, for us to think a little bit about what the term global means here, because it's much bandied about in scholarly discourse, but in ways that I think are often not analytically very constructive. That's to say, it's useful for us to understand that we're part of an interlocking network of countries, and that's one meaning of global. But we need to understand it beyond that global connections, if we want to, if you may, involve power, involve relationships between these countries, and they are not necessarily relationships among equals. That globalism is not about equality. It's about networks and it's about networks often of unequal and distinct accesses to power, to authority, to goods, to materials. I had a problem with my computer last month. I got on the phone and I called Dell Computer. And the man immediately remotely connected my computer and talked to me, and he was only in the Philippines doing the work at the time. He was skilled, he was English speaking, he was part of a team of 1,000, he told me, working there in the Philippines. Why was he there? Because skills could be developed, but also because costs were low, obviously, for Dell. It made it cheap to use back offices. It was part of a global connection, but the global connection shouldn't be allowed to mask other questions one needs to ask about the changing character or how globalism functions. That's all I guess I'm asking you to think about in all of this. Who were the bigwigs? And where did they go? And what did they do? Well, I should tell you a little bit about this costume, perhaps, as a point of entree to all of this. Some of you know I have a book coming out next month called City Folk, and it's about dance revivals in the Americas in the 20th century. And the dance that they were reviving was called English country dance. And English country dance is what English gentlemen and gentry and earlier common folk did on the village green. The Americans were English. So the Americans took varieties of that, and it became later what we came to call American country dance or contra dance or square dance. But that's a story really for the 19th century. The English who were here in New York in the 60s and 70s were doing English country dances to the music that you were listening to. They were trained by dancing masters. They are people who supposedly knew these dances, had studied them, and could lead people through the dances. On a rare Tuesday night, I am occasionally a dancing master in New York City and will teach these dances to the English country dance community in New York. Piece of arcane information. Okay? And at some point later, in the semester, I'll show you a little bit of this when we get to the revival, because people began to worry about licentious dancing. They worried about people doing dances that were wicked and had uncontrolled bodies, especially about immigrant women. And they offered as an alternative to it respectable forms of dancing. There was nothing more respectable than English country dancing. And it's because it was dancing, if you've seen the production of Emma, that just concluded last night, or Pride and Prejudice, it was not dancing like waltzing in which you put your hands around somebody, but was dancing at arm's distance. It was done at assemblies and at balls. Colonial Americans danced. And as a British colony, they did English country dance. It was a dance that dominated most venues. And it was a dance that allowed the people to show their respectability and mark off their stature. Not uncommon. For instance, one of the best known American dancers in the 18th century was a man by the name of George Washington. He was famous, actually, for his minuet and for his English country dance. The dances would take on American inflections. So one famous dance called Sir Roger de Clovery, we know as the Virginia Reel, but its real name is Sir Roger de Clovery. Later dances were rewritten and written during this period with English titles. You heard some of them here. They were called things like Washington's Reel, Liberty, Burgoyne's Defeat, Saw You My Hero, George, or a dance that was also known as Lady Washington. So the dances were ways to celebrate American loyalty. They become ways, that's to say, of taking dances of an English tradition and creating them as part of an American tradition, but where dancers would show their status. Give you an example. George Washington danced a minuet with Lucy Knox, the wife of General Knox, to open a Philadelphia ball in 1779, inspiring a local news account to wax that, quote, "When this man," meaning George Washington, "unbends his leg, it unbends from his station and its weighty functions, he's even then like a philosopher who mixes with the amusements of the world, that he may teach what is right or turn trifles into instruction." He was thought to be one of the most beautiful dancers in America. elite fashion develops outside these colonial assemblies. The bowling green was where people went and walked and promenaded to show off their finery. In the 19th century, that will become places like Central Park. Say they're always, and you'll see there's a moment in which it will become Washington Square Park. We'll talk about later. So places get geographically marked for certain kinds of occasions and certain kinds of people to show off. Fashionable residences appear, where again elites spend money on fancy houses. Stuyvesant and Delancey settled east around Seward's Park. You know, actually, the 3rd Avenue dorm. If you just go east from the 3rd Avenue dorm, you're going to be dealing with where Peter Stuyvesant's family had its home. Okay? That was all, and you know it as far north as what we call Stuyvesant Town, the housing development. It's all Peter Stuyvesant's property. Even after, in other words, he was deposed, he had been given large amounts of land, and he continued to own it. So there's a history of large landowners, and they continue to have a good deal of wealth. And they build their housing accordingly. Let's see. James Delancey, remember the Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor? He had 340 acres from the Bowery to the East River. Basically, all of the Lower East Side during the 18th century was owned by the Delancey family. Okay? We'll give them credit. We'll just call it Delancey Street, but they had a lot more than that. Okay? That's just one street through that network. Similarly, there was a great tracts of almost unbroken land and estates on the east side and on the west side. Chelsea, for instance, was the mansion of Captain Thomas Clark, who acquires that land, and he models it after London's fashionable suburban manner. And he owns the land basically all the way from 14th to 29th Street, 8th to 10th Avenue, what's called Old Chelsea, not the area where the art galleries were. Area 10, not 11th Avenue, the 10th Avenue side. It's the area which becomes the birthplace, by the way, of his son-in-law, Clement Clarkmore, who's the author of The Night Before Christmas, but that's just a bit of trivia for later. Elite institutions mark this period. Education. Landed interests wants wider military operations against the French, and they're led by a triumvirate, William Livingston, John Scott, and William Smith. They're all Yale graduates. They're all lawyers and they're Presbyterians. The merchant elite is led by Delancey, and he charters King's College as an Anglican institution, okay? As a specifically Anglican institution. It's initially located just 2 blocks north of land that's given to them north of Fulton Street, on land given to them by Trinity Church, which is the major landholder. These various professions begin to legitimize the institutions that are being created. The physicians create their own school at King's College. The first medical school in 1767. It is the second one in the United States. The first one's in Philadelphia. So again, they're establishing an institution for their own advancement. In 1764, the New York Bar the lawyers organize a New York bar, largely to control admissions. And to this day, it's the ABA, the bar, the American Bar Association, that decides the legitimacy of any law school. So they are able to control and limit the number of lawyers. They've not been terribly successful. Everyone and their brother seems to be a lawyer. But they were at one point able to limit the number of lawyers, and they can still do so to this day. A little bit of information I can tell you about that is that they initially required 2 years of college. That was one way to restrict admission. And 5-year clerkships. And they limited the number of lawyers in New York to 35, all of whom, it might be noted, were people with rather deep pockets. So the number of lawyers was controlled, 35 people, rich folks. And of course, male. That almost goes without saying, but I should remind you that's the case. As to elite culture, not a lot. there's some newspapers. In addition to the schools of medicine, King's College, which becomes Columbia, of course, which is Columbia later. The Bar Association. Very little architecture. The architecture that we do have really is the old Dutch architecture. Colonial-style Dutch Collegiate Church, much later. But that's what that kind of architecture, I only put that there for you to begin to see the kind of architecture we're talking about. You'll notice the roof, kind of conventional roofing. There's the colonial piece that we have, the colonial facade. Again, meant to respect authority. To respect authority. This is really Georgian rather than Dutch. Those are the two alternatives that you have. By the turn of the century, you'll have federal style, which is post-Georgian. That's the style that you'll see built in the early 1830s. Washington Square North is the example of that. Okay, we'll come back to that later. Entertainment for the rich, bowling, promenades, assemblies, fireworks, bear baiting, bull baiting, cockfights. Put an animal in a ring, stick a pin in it, and watch him go. That's what it amounts to.
Is that bear baiting and bull? What is that?
Bull baiting and bear baiting. It's like cockfighting, only with putting a bear in a circle and a bull in a circle. Okay. What is the life of the commoner like? What about everybody else? The percentage of the people that we're talking about, people who could afford clothes like this, were fairly few in number. The people who could live in the finest houses were fewer in number. Much larger number of people were needed to build those houses. A much larger number of people were needed to be servants in all of those houses. Okay? So what was their life like? They shared some of the activities of the rich. So they also drank. There were bars for them, just as there were bars for the rich. They didn't go to the same bars, and the circumstances were quite different. The rich went to places like Faunce's Tavern, downtown, where the Colonial Assembly would meet when George Washington would come here. Whereas the poor went to what were basically tippling inns. They went to what you would know in the 1920s as speakeasies, basically saloons. Okay? Not places really for leisure in the sense that they were meant to be fine lighting. They would be minimally outfitted. Okay? Minimally outfitted. There were social conditions that the poor experienced that were not the same as those of the rich. The paving of streets was available in New York. There were cobblestone streets. But they did not exist in any of the poor areas. So not surprisingly, the cobblestone streets that we had during that period were almost exclusively in the areas of the well-to-do. There were sidewalks, but only on Broadway and only up to St. Paul's Chapel. No one else had a sidewalk. There was street cleaning, but mostly for the well-to-do. The rich sent slaves with slop and chamber pots to the rivers. Everyone else used open gutters. So that meant you walked the streets, but there were open gutters rather than sidewalks. And the open gutters were where the slop, daily refuse, was put. In 1731, cartmen begin to pick up some of that. You'll see that's the origins of what will be called sanitation. Remember, they are going to be the one kind of licensed trade. We talked about which ones are organized and which ones aren't. There is a network of sewers that does exist but only after 1769. So through most of this colonial period of America's history, there are no such things as sewers, I'm talking about. Okay? The city was a place that smelled, and it smelled badly. That was called daily life. And that was daily life for most people. There was little light after dark, except there were a few lamplighters in the middle of the century who were on the city payroll. So the beginnings really of what we might call an urban labor force involved a few people who light some lamps with using whale oil in lamps in the city. But on the whole, the city is dark after nightfall, except inside taverns and inside homes where people had fires. And only the rich, on the whole, could afford lamps. Candles are used. They also cost money. They also all create fires. Fortunately, we had fire protection. Well, some. There were fire wardens as early as 1664. But a two-hand pump was brought over as an engine from England in 1711, and a six-person brigade is housed in City Hall as early as 1737. And New York City starts manufacturing its own fire engines in 1772. That's to say, there is a fire protection. It is minimal, absolutely minimal. There is no city service for it. And fires, as we saw in last week's lecture, talking about what happened in 1712 and 1740, always scared the bejesus out of everybody. It was a terrifying thought. And they generally break out all the time and are terribly disruptive. Okay. Again, only the rich, on the whole, could afford to build houses out of stone. So the houses are all made up of timber. The proof in the pudding to the danger is that there are virtually no remnants of 17th century and hardly any remnants of 18th century New York left in Manhattan. Okay. You get something like this, which is not made, which is of stone, and that's the kind of examples you get. Virtually everything else dates from the early 19th century, okay, where it exists. And we mean by that 1830s forward. Virtually nothing before that. I've told you the place where you will find some earlier. Some of it will be in Brooklyn. My first walking tour will take some of you to see some of it. The rest you will see the third walking tour, and it means taking us all the way out to the nether bowels of Queens, the bowels of Queens, to see that. Flushing. Okay. What about drinking water? Not very good. New York today, of course, has about the finest drinking water you can have. Potable water was very hard to find in all of 18th century New York. Supposedly, even the horses refused to drink it. And plans for a reservoir discussed as early as 1774, but of course there's a little war that gets in the way of all of that, and then it doesn't remain a very high priority. It only becomes a high priority when disease breaks out, and it only becomes a very high priority when the rich worry about the disease. Okay? And when there's some fear that the rich are going to get the disease. That's the point. Only in the 1840s that a reservoir actually gets active interest in a reservoir. Finally, there are a few city police. It's a night watchman. Service started in 1762, but again, absolutely minimal. Come in. 1762. In sum, what we have are skeleton urban services. But it is institutionalized for the first time. We have, in other words, the beginnings of the notion that the city ought to be doing these things and that the city is prepared to hire an urban labor force to provide services. So we don't really have a police force. We have a few night watchmen. We don't really have a fire brigade, but we have we have 6 firemen at City Hall. We don't really have sanitation, but we have some cartmen picking up the slop. We have, that's to say, in place, the institutional commitment to being able to do some of those kinds of things. And that's really important. Okay? At the same time, it's important to understand it mostly served the wealthy, the few services that we had, and that its primary objective, the scope that it has, was primarily to protect property from fire and theft. That was the objective. It was protecting property rights, fire and theft. That's to say, the services were going to be paid for by the wealthy. It makes sense. They were not interested in protecting the poor. They were interested in protecting themselves from somebody who might be stealing from them. Protecting property interests. Not a bad thing, not a good thing, a reality. What did this group of working people, seamen, laborers, what we might call proletarians, do? Well, they danced. Jack Tar, the proverbial seaman, he would kick up his heels at a dockyard tavern with a hornpipe, a jig, or also things that came from England. That became mixed in, we know, with some African-American dancing forms that were being done on some of the plantations and are being mixed in. So it's not as if only rich people danced. Okay? Everybody did forms of it, and they will begin to merge in the 19th century. But life was not all one of dancing and tease. It was also one of great poverty. And the treatment of poverty reflected the attitudes of those with ruffled shirts. Say the conditions of poverty were made, I'm sorry, my ruffled shirts are hidden in my sleeves, but they're there somewhere. My wife said that a true gentleman would have ironed all of his linen. This true gentleman had just stuck it in a closet. Poverty and associations to deal with poverty for the poor continue a theme that we raised last time. Internal threats raised by the specter of poor people, the specter of people who were thought to be, we put the word in quotes, other, meaning other than me, okay? Other than respectable. People who were, they could be Native Americans, Indians, they could be black people, they might be the Irish, they might be those Spanish Moorish people who were swarthy, they might be anybody they thought to be, that made us anxious. Maybe it was just somebody who seemed at home in their body, and that made me anxious about not feeling at home in my body. The issues around sexuality that we alluded to last time as well. Attitudes toward the poor were shaped by Englishness and the inheritance that the dominant people in the settlements had, north, in the middle Atlantic states, and in the south, from Protestantism in its various guises. The key, of course, was Calvinism in New England, but you must remember that the Dutch Reformed Church was every bit as much Calvinist as the Puritans and Pilgrims. The English Church was a little different. It was Anglican. How is Anglicanism different than Congregationalism? Anybody know? What was the main difference?
The king appoints bishops.
Instead of the Pope. That was the main difference initially. Okay? On the whole, the Anglican Church was as close to the Catholic Church as you could get in terms of its attitudes about piety. Okay? Its attitudes about piety. It was different in one major structural form. It didn't recognize the Pope. Instead, it was the Church, the King of England, the Archbishop of England. That had to do with Henry VIII, remember, wanting to have a lot of wives. The Pope wasn't going to let it, so he said, screw you, I'll make myself the Pope, as it were. He didn't say it quite that nicely. Okay. So the Anglican Church also has the same piety, so it's not so different. Well, what are those attitudes? Well, they come out of, if you know Calvin, the Institutes of the Christian tradition, the Institutes from Calvin suggest, as I tried to last time, they begin with the notion that in society, we have an omniscient God. We have an all-powerful God. And we are immersed in sin. Everyone is immersed in sin. Everything is predestined. All were damned before time. Now, that's not time like 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock. It's like time with a capital T. Okay? The big time, before yesterday, way back time, big time T. You can't imagine when it was predestined. It was done. Your fate was determined. And you should know, you all stink in the nostrils of God. As Winthrop pointed out, Massachusetts Bay is the dung heap of the universe. And the same could have been said for any other part of these colonies by people of that mentality. We live in the dung heap of the universe in theological terms. That's to say, totally depraved. But in that context, God in his infinite variety is good. Okay? He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's omni-everything, as I've said before. But he is good. And in his goodness, he has infinite variety in which some are rich and some are poor. Not better or worse. Some are rich and some are poor because God has given you different skills. He's made some of you into weavers. He's made some of you into seamen. And he's made some of you into slave drivers because he has infinite variety. Some are rich and some are poor. And because everything is predestined before time, we know not to muck about with God's infinite variety. Don't presume to know that which only the Lord can know. And don't presume to muck about with what God has granted you, your wealth and your poverty. That doesn't mean that God was cruel and people were just poor. Rather, it suggested that there were signs of gracious affection that everyone could look for to find out if God nonetheless had chosen some of you and you were among the elect. And so, part of what made Puritans always, I would say, schizophrenic and a little crazy people is that they knew that they could never know anything, and yet they were always told that they could find out if they were among the elect. That you were allowed to know whether you were chosen among the chosen few, but you could never, but if you acknowledged that you probably were not among the chosen few, but you had to prove to people that you were among the elect so you could get into church. It was a little crazy. And those who were in let their own kind in, on the whole. And you looked for signs of gracious affection, one of which might have been that you caught a lot of codfish, or that you had accumulated a lot of wealth. And maybe that was an indication that God loved you. But in fact, Calvin pointed out that you have nothing was a sign that God loved you as well. Because God loves those, he wouldn't go out of his way to deprive you of everything if he didn't want you to focus all your attention on the Lord, so that you wouldn't spend your time thinking about all those material acquisitions. God loves the poor especially. That's why he makes them poor, so that they will be able to focus on him, says Calvin in the Institutes of Christian Religion. So it was important to have a sense that there was social stability. On the other hand, it was important to demonstrate that the society was going to succeed. And what would happen if poor people suddenly started starving? What would happen if poor people suddenly got uppity and started demanding something that they shouldn't have? What happens if there was what Calvin called a time of community in peril? Say a hurricane comes and destroys the city. What happens to a community in peril? And he laid out guidelines for all of that. And he tried to make clear that we have a responsibility to help one another. To help one another. But there are guidelines for helping one another. We have to make sure that first and foremost, the person has the ability to pay us back. Because whatever money you have, first and foremost, you need to make sure it takes care of yourself and your own family. So to the extent possible, make sure people can repay you. these people were all these people writing these tracts were all merchants and lawyers, as you can hear. Give, that's to say, as much as you can, but according to your dictates, not according to the dictates of the poor. Okay? But it was important if these communities were to be a beacon to the rest of the world, if Massachusetts Bay, as Jonathan Winthrop described it, was to be the new Israel of our time, the city on a hill. If New York City, if the colonies were to be a beacon to the rest of the world, if America was to be an example to the rest of the world, then we couldn't allow ourselves to fail. But we had to maintain inequality to the extent to which it is God's infinite variety. So there had to be standards to alleviate the conditions of peril, to sustain it. 3. First, regulation. That there would be no combinations allowed. People would not be allowed to conspire, to work together, to overthrow other groups. That meant effectively, the modern term for that we called, by the way, strikes and unions. They called them combinations. So they did not allow workers to form organizations that would bring themselves together on the assumption that that would undermine God's infinite variety which was given to individuals. The second way of dealing with the poor, so first was to regulate the poor, provide regulations for their, like apprenticeship regulations. Make sure how people were trained, how many people were trained, etc. The second was eviction. If people were poor, kick out the undesirables. Create residency requirements. And indeed, all newcomers to the colony were scrutinized to make sure that they had enough means to sustain themselves. It could be argued that Stuyvesant, for instance, was not anti-Semitic. It could be argued that Stuyvesant was concerned primarily that the Jews didn't have enough money to support themselves. When all their goods were taken from them, they would in fact be too poor and the state would have to support them. And that was the problem. So in fact, there's a regular policy of looking at people immigrating into making sure that they are not going to be dependent on the society, on the state, by which it meant dependent on people of means. So there were evictions. And the third policy was outdoor relief. What we might now call the origins of welfare, giving something. Again, the first condition, not unlike you heard from coming out of Calvin, give to the deserving poor. Don't give to those that are lazy. Give to those who truly are indigent rather than those who have failed to meet their own potential, their God-given potential. Who are the deserving poor? It meant that aid was given to couples where one of the partners was temporarily ill. Sickness. It was given to widows who were believed to be in good health, competent widows, rather than widows who were believed to also be lazy. It was given to mothers with small children, but only on a temporary basis. Things haven't changed quite so much. And it was given, again, to aged, sick, and disabled women. Aged, sick, and disabled women. So what you're hearing there is that it was already policy that held men to different standards than women. Okay? This early aid was, in fact, only being given to women rather than to men, primarily to women rather than to men. Then, to discourage the poor, New York City followed an English custom and required all recipients of aid to wear a badge. It wasn't a yellow star, but it was a little badge. A little different era. That's to say, you were to be marked as someone who was being dependent on the state, something that would hopefully provide an incentive to you to no longer want to become dependent, to get rid of that marking as quickly as possible. But so people also could report on whether they thought your behavior was appropriate or inappropriate. The primary role of philanthropic and charitable societies was to give relief to people of your own background. So it was not the state that was expected to aid people, but it was expected rather that families would aid families and that ethnic groups would aid their own ethnic groups. So among the earliest of these societies is the Scots Charitable Society, formed in 1744. And its objective, there, as you can imagine, as a consequence, was to give relief to Scots, not to non-Scots, only to Scots. And it was not to be Scots-free, as it were. Sorry about that pun. It was rather to employ poor Scots to spin cotton, linen, and wool. It was effectively workfare. That was the treatment of the poor, and we'll resume that story as it goes into the 19th century when the poor will the numbers of the poor will accelerate. But it's the origins, as you can see, really of a fairly punitive and minimalist policy about state aid that's inflected and informed by attitudes that come out of an English, largely Protestant tradition that presumes that there ought to be different levels of inequality, doesn't have a notion of equality. It emphasizes liberty over equality, and it presumes the protection of property, and it presumes the primary role of the rich in determining what kind of benefits should go to the poor. Okay? The poor are a substantial part of the population, but we've talked about the poor and we've talked about the rich. What about everybody else, the middling folks? That's actually a fairly substantial sector in between that we need to talk a little bit about, because they're the ones who are going to increasingly gain a place in the 1750s economy, and they're going to be crucial to the political upheaval in the decades to follow in this last half of the 18th century. They are the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, the innkeepers, the sugar boilers, the cordwainers. What does a cordwainer make? Cordwainer? Cordwainer. Okay. The shoemakers. Cordwainers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, etc. These are people who actually, and the shipbuilders, they're also doing rather well during this period because the economy is beginning to get organized around this commercial trade. The bulk of the middling sort are laborers. They're doing manual labor. But they do it, but there's enough work to provide regular employment for many of these people. And with enough employment, they can begin to buy a small piece of land. That's to say, they can begin to become marginally a part of the propertied class. And those are the magic words in New York, in colonial society. Now, lands near the docks was much too expensive, so they don't even try for that. The only land available was land that was owned by Trinity Church on the west side, between Cortland and Christopher Streets. So it's from downtown, you think of your subway stops, right? Cortland all the way up to Christopher Streets on the west side. That's the land that Trinity Church owns. It's the last bits of land that's available. North of there becomes Chelsea, remember? In 1762, Trinity has all that land surveyed and broken into blocks. And then each block into 200 lots, 20 by 100. With leases. The leases actually have fairly reasonable rates for laborers to begin to be able to buy a small piece of land. And we have the beginnings of what historians have described, I think Gotham does this as well, as the beginning of a kind of proto-working class neighborhood that begins to emerge on the west side. So by mid-century, class is probably too strong a word for it at this point, but social differences have begun to emerge with real economic cleavages in the kinds of access to power and resources that exist between at least three distinct social groupings in New York. We've got the rich, we've got the poor, and we've got these middling groups who are increasingly going to be laborers and artisans and skilled workmen, semi-skilled workmen. The bigwigs, the foppish style of the bigwigs, like I'm dressed, would have been seen, but they would have been in specific places. Like one club was called the Macaroni Club, which opened in New York in 1764. It was a club that was started in London by those emulating the high Italianate style. And in those years after 64, when there are increasing conflicts with England, remember, start exactly at that time with the Sugar Act, 63 and 64. The artisans begin to ridicule people who they see as aping the English. And they parody it in a song, which I played for you earlier, if some of you were listening. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, put a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. It's in the Macaroni Club. And that's the origins of making fun. That was a political broadside that becomes popular in the 60s against the English. It is the cultural form of social protest among these social classes. It reflects the growing sense of antagonism and identification of these middling sorts that the rich are increasingly identified with Tories, with England. And that, of course, is not true everywhere. It is more true in New York than any place else of the colonies. There are early, in fact, evidence that there are real limits to plebeian deference. We've talked about this as a deferential society, as a society that recognizes status, hierarchy, that's told that it's even immoral to break out of those things. And a society that often lives in respect, as you ought to have, but hopefully a little bit of awe and fear about those with a big wig coming in your midst. But that deference increasingly, there are signs that it's beginning to be undermined, that deference is increasingly masking what people are thinking and sometimes expressing in private. And you'll begin to read about some of those forms of behavior, one of which was early evidence, that's to say, of smoldering resentments against Yankee Doodle and the Macaroni Club, against England, but maybe against others as well who they see as aligned with England, the rich. Pope's Day festivals rise and change their meaning, and you'll be reading something about Pope's Day. It is traditionally held on November 5th as an English patriotic holiday, commemorating the failed plot in England. We are English, remember, until next week, till Wednesday rather. Okay? Commemorating the failed plot of Guy Fawkes to blow up Parliament. It is celebrated in New York City once the city becomes English in the middle of the 17th century. They celebrate Pope's Day, and they celebrate it with patriotic speeches by officials. The plebes, plebeian dissenters, begin to appropriate that holiday in the 1740s. And it becomes a plebeian occasion for the carnivalesque. What do we mean by the carnivalesque? What happens in Carnival? Anybody give an example of carnivalesque in which you all participate at the end of October? Halloween. And what does it mean to be the carnival? What do you do at Halloween? You dress up to be somebody you are not. Okay? Often taking on identities of those who you would heartily choose to ridicule in public on other days. Gay men and women deciding to dress up like the Pope, or to parade as drag queens in public in ways that they'd otherwise feel more constrained on other days. People dressing up as plutocrats, as President Obama, George Bush, Sarah Palin, whomever they feel they want to ridicule. The idea isn't to celebrate people, it's to be making fun of people. So it's opportunities to wear a mask as an opportunity, as a moment in which you can actually protest who you are and what you mean. Okay. The plebes appropriate that holiday with raucous parades by tradesmen, artisans, sailors, and slaves, in which they take effigies of the Pope, of the pretender and the devil, and throw them all into the bonfire together, and start taking on other kinds of political symbols. In the 1760s, as taxes begin to be passed, secular politics will begin to take these official moments and use them as transformative political events, fueling cries for revolution, so that the British authorities may or may not be able to identify them. Putting on masks when they throw tea into a harbor, for example. Though depending on the relationship of the authorities to the protest, the level of protest, the danger of violence getting out of hand, all this protest would be thought about very differently. And these are the categories we will have to interrogate as we go forward. The protest could be thought to be that of an unthinking mob. And you'll find throughout our history, as we move forward into the 19th century, every time there's a piece of social protest, newspaper accounts will be describing it as the acts of a mob. That's to say, a category that presumes it is an unthinking, irrational group of people. If you can name it that, you can discount it because it's irrational. It could become instead the politicized crowd, a term that's much more neutral and presumes that it has political content, the crowd, that it's a form of social protest. That's to say, the group can be seen as either rabble or revolutionary, as either loyalists or patriots. Or they could change over time. The history of we the rabble, we the revolutionaries, we the loyalists, we the patriots will be Wednesday's lecture.